This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien begins the show with a grain market update. There is drought in other countries, and Dan explains which ones are impacting the markets the most. Continuing the show is Lucas Haag, K-State grain agronomist, with things producers should consider as they plan to cut the short wheat out of their fields. There are many options available to producers to hopefully reduce yield loss. Finishing this week's shows is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with an outlook on the weather. People across Kansas can expect to see an increase in temperatures. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and as we usually do on Fridays, we have a grain market update, and as always, we're joined by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us once again.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Appreciate it.
Starting the conversation on grain markets, what are futures looking like?
Well, yesterday we saw a lot of volatility, worries about dry conditions both in the U.S. and some forecasts of continued dry weather crop impacts out of Argentina really affected the soybean market. Soybean futures with the July contract closed up 40 cents to $14.28 for the close. And then the August contract shot up 50 cents a bushel, September 57.5, and November, January of next year, again, both 50, 52 and on from there. So a big impact on the markets. You know, I see a 50 cent move on something that's already priced at 12 or 13. It's not quite a it's not a 5% change, but it's 4, 5, 6, 7%. So you've got from a financial point of view, you're really changing the value of an ag asset. Corn moved up to the high side some. We saw July futures closed yesterday, 4.5 cents higher, up to 6.12. D's corn, again, we're watching those new crop contracts, 5.56 in the quarter, and again, just from where we were, but about just a few weeks ago, we were below $5. I think we got down to 4.90, 4.85 at one time, and now with these weather concerns, particularly in the 3I states, again, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, eastern Nebraska, parts of the states that touch them, parts of Kansas, no doubt, but more so to the east, we are seeing a lot of concern about how this current dry weather continues to hang on, isn't alleviated by moisture, and is likely to impact corn and soybean prices down the road. So that's affected the market. The wheat market also jumped. The July hard red winter wheat contract off the CME in Chicago, up 27 cents to 8.12 and 3/4. And anymore, we're getting so used to the volatility that 27 cents, it's important, but we just keep whipsawing back and forth 20, 30 cents. So there was a day last week we were up 30 cents, down then a day or so after, up again. We've got ongoing issues that continue to occur in Europe with the Russia-Ukraine situation. Again, Antonina Briaca in our shop at K-State could talk at length about that. But anyway, you've got 27 cent gain in the futures in the July lead futures just before we come into our own wheat harvest. So if I can go on, I'll go on and talk about cash prices too. What's interesting to watch is how for corn, although we have support for, again, the futures markets, we've seen a softening of basis in kind of the bellwether basis leading area of the state, southwest Kansas, around that Garden City area, not right in Garden City, but necessarily alone, but in within 20, 30, 40 miles of that, taking the highest bids. We have a positive basis of 50 cents over, which is a very good basis, but still we had seen as much as $1.40 in the not too distant past. So you've got a little bit of change like that happening. Still good prices. New crop bids are looking, if anything, we've seen kind of a softening of cash and some strengthening of some key new crop bids in the area for corn. Grain sorghum holding up pretty well. We've talked about that before, how in some parts of the state, particularly around Topeka, Salina, in the eastern part, you see sorghum bids holding up as good or better than the corn bids. Best grain sorghum bid in Columbus, southeast corner, $6.49, 26 cents over, and the best corn bid, the $6.49, the best corn bid is $6.38. So we are seeing some changes happening now, I think mainly in response to these weather conditions and probably inventory management decisions and local businesses all coming into play and affecting the corn and sorghum markets. For soybeans, again, that 50 cent jumps in soybeans certainly affected cash prices. Top cash price bid yesterday was in Topeka, $14.23, Salina, $13.79, $13.93 in Hutchinson. Upfront bid, the new crop bids again are above $12. The best one, at least yesterday's best ones, all three of them were all $12.42 in Topeka, Salina, and Hutchinson, $12.32 in Columbus, and around $12 in western Kansas. So interesting to watch that. And Shelby, here we're coming into the wheat harvest, and typically a time of a lot of weakness. That's kind of confounded this year with areas that have had such crop damage as opposed to not. We are seeing cash prices. Strongest cash prices yesterday were in Salina at $8.13 and Hutchinson at $8.12. That's certainly affected by the what happened in the futures markets. New crop bids for basically July. You see top bids again a month from now for $7.68 and actually $7.99 in Hutchinson, $7.58 in Colby, $7.68 in Garden City, etc. So lots going on in those markets. I've had this thought of late that we wonder about the impact of interest rates, and as interest rates have gone higher, they've affected agricultural producers' cost of production numbers and the amount of money they have to borrow to go forth. I wonder when I see weakening of basis and feed grains and other, if at least one factor may be that higher interest rates make it more difficult for businesses that buy these grains, corn and grain sorghum, to keep larger inventories and then pay interest on those for longer periods of time. It kind of, in a way, higher interest rates kind of force us to be more hand to mouth. And if anything, if the crop issues in the Eastern Corn Belt come about and that we see in the markets growing really skittish about having adequate supplies, it could make us more volatile once we get out, again, 30, 60, 90 days off in the future, just because we have this economic incentive not to hold a bunch of inventories. So I guess we'll watch and see where that goes.
And Dan, something I want to kind of swing back to is you mentioned it's dry, but before we even started this interview, you mentioned it's not only dry in the U.S., but it's really dry in a lot of different places across the world.
Argentina came out yesterday and had an in-country report of their soybean crop being down another 234 million metric tons, even from the latest USDA numbers that happened from the last WASDE report released on the 9th of June. So I think that's one of the major factors that affected the soybean market yesterday. I think some concerns also about dryness for palm oil, as I understand that. In the world, we don't grow palm oil in the U.S., but it affects the oilseed oil market. So that's at play. And there are some concerns about dryness in France that affects wheat. We have this underlying issue going on right now that certainly needs to be thought about. And it comes back again to the impact of that Russia-Ukraine war with the inability to ship wheat as readily as Ukraine would like. They've taken and went by land up into neighboring countries to their west, and has caused some real gluts of grain over the border into Poland, the countries nearby, and that's caused problems for the farmers there. And there's EU government money coming in. Well, anyway, that has affected the grain market in Europe. Again, there's a whole slug of Ukrainian grain that's come into Eastern Europe and has lowered the price of grain. So we have reports in the ag media, a lot of concern about how those prices for wheat in that part of the world are so low that it becomes almost, if not, has become economical to buy wheat from there and have export companies ship Eastern Europe wheat across the Atlantic Ocean into the United States and still make money relative to the cash prices that we're seeing here. So I know a lot of folks like in Kansas Wheat, U.S. Wheat Council, a whole number of places are concerned about that because it really I guess presents pretty tough competition for the U.S., both in terms of domestic cash prices as well as on the export front. So what I can vouch for is the quality of that wheat. Is it just quantity alone, and what can the millers and bakers do with that? To the degree that we have that happening, it certainly is a concern in the wheat market. I guess I will be wondering what happens when we actually get our harvest going, when we have the quality of wheat that we'll have here in the U.S., those supplies are available. Then I'm curious to see whether that stream of wheat coming that started to come into the U.S. from these other places, very cheap priced, if that abates or not. So it's something surely worth watching.
And Dan, as we wrap up today's show, something that you've worked on putting together are some outlooks.
To get right to the point, the USDA numbers, basically their trend line yield, they assume normal, and those projections were made 2-3 months ago for corn, 181.5 bushels per acre. And with the numbers with the weather conditions that have come in, it's very likely that at least it opens the door for questions as to whether we'll get to the 181.5 bushels per acre. It's about 15.3 billion bushels. If you look at alternative scenarios, 177 bushels per acre, about 14.9 billion, 174 bushels per acre for the U.S., ends up about a 14.6 billion bushel figure. Then you end up with tightening stocks to use and sharply higher prices. So that's something I'm watching. If we were to drop to 177 bushels an acre by the time we make a set of assumptions going forward, instead of the USDA's projection of $4.80, well, it's like $5.40. If you get to 174 and things really tighten up, it's something closer to $6. So I think the markets right now are struggling with that to try to reconcile that uncertainty. I've got similar numbers that a person can see on our www.AgManager.info website in K-State Ag Economics that can lay out wheat as well as soybean scenarios. But the big issue right now is that of corn, and wondering about what our final corn yield will be, how tight stocks to use will get, and where that could take the U.S. price of corn as we move on into future months.
A lot of information, Dan. I appreciate you once again joining us and giving us a rundown of what you've seen happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby. I appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. And as always, we'll link his information in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and because of recent conditions we've had through the wheat growing time period and all of the drought and everything combined, the wheat isn't super tall, which people might want to think about when choosing to go out and harvest the wheat this year. And so to talk about some considerations for producers, we have K-State Extension agronomist in Colby and Tribune, Lucas Haag. Lucas, thanks for coming on today.
You bet, Shelby.
I said the wheat short. Obviously, a lot of people saw that through the wheat plot tours and all those different things. So we have our usual of how we harvest wheat, but what are some other alternative technologies that people could use?
As you mentioned, both short and thin stands, and those both contribute to creating some challenges for harvest. And so, one of the things we've talked about is we've got some alternative technologies out there, header technologies that we can use. So stripper heads, drapers and flex drapers, and then also the use of air reels are three things that we can look at to help in these situations where you've got short, thin wheat to harvest.
So kind of working our way through all those different options you just mentioned, what about stripper heads? Why would possibly a producer want to choose this option?
Yes, we've seen a fairly significant adoption of stripper heads, especially in the western part of the state, because in years like this, we want to keep as much of that stubble intact as possible, especially in our dry land systems. And so stripper heads allow us to do that and can help us go after some short wheat, lodged wheat. But like anything, and actually probably more so on stripper heads than some of our other options, there's some adjustments. There's a lot of things. Making sure you have a trained operator and you're making those adjustments in the field can make a huge difference in the performance of that header. And so we want to make sure that on stripper heads, there's the nose of the hood that goes out. We got to make sure that height is correct relative to the heads of the wheat. One of the challenges we will have with stripper heads this year is with the thinner stands, we can have more header loss unless we keep our ground speeds up. So stripper heads are really the only harvesting equipment where header loss actually goes down the faster you drive. And so we got to keep those ground speeds up to minimize our shatter loss with the thin stands we have. So, but again, making sure we've got the rotor in the right position, the nose in the right position, and then keeping our ground speeds up can let us get some of the short wheat with the stripper head and while minimizing our losses.
So one option you mentioned beforehand. Another one was draper headers and flex heads.
Yeah, so draper heads, one of the benefits they have this year is with that draper belt. One of the big challenges we're going to have with conventional headers is there's just simply not enough material to get it to feed well into the header correctly. And so with the draper head, of course, we've got a very short distance between the cutter bar and the conveyor belt. And so that allows us, we can rock that cutter bar back and help that material move into the machine without piling up on the cutter bar. And so the other thing we got to pay attention to is sickles and guards, and that goes true not only for draper heads, but also our conventional heads. With thinner stands, thinner material, making sure that sickles and guards are in good shape is going to go a long ways in helping us get that short, thin crop into the machine. And so one of the other things we've talked about, both for draper heads and for conventional heads, anywhere we've got a reel is, adding some belting, some type of material on there to kind of help sweep the material back into the, past the cutter bar back into the platform. And so that's something we can look at, repurposed baler belting, hanging from the bats of the reel, something I've seen people do with pretty good success. And so, if we're using we talked about stripper heads and maintaining that stubble height. If we're using drapers or conventionals, a good rule of thumb is we'd really like to leave about 2/3 of the full plant height standing. A lot of research would show that the vast majority of the grain is in that top third of overall plant height. Sometimes we've got, especially this year, we're seeing a lot of late developing tillers further down in the canopy. But typically that grain's not well developed, and we often blow it out the rear of the machine anyways in the harvesting process. So back to the topic at hand. So, drapers and flex drapers can be a really good tool for short crops.
And another possible tool for people harvesting shorter wheat is air reels.
Yeah, so we air reels again help us. That overall challenge with short wheat is getting that material conveyed past the cutter bar back into the auger or to the draper belt. And so there's a couple manufacturers on the market that have air reels out there, and so they can certainly be advantageous. And if a grower grows both wheat and soybeans, there's potential for double use. There's a lot of potential benefits for air reels in soybeans as well, and so might help make the economics of that a little bit better.
A lot of different options you've mentioned here, and if people are like, I want to try something new, and even just renting it for a year instead of buying it, how might they go about choosing which one they want to test?
Yeah, so I think it probably goes back a little bit in terms of what your overall objectives are. Certainly if you're in a dry land system or out in western Kansas, I'd really suggest taking a look at renting. If you've been curious about stripper heads, this might be an opportunity to rent one and get a chance to look at that. If you're someone who also grows soybeans in your rotation and you've been thinking about a different style of draper head or an air reel, that might make more sense to take a look at something like that.
For people who maybe it's just not in the finances for this year and are sticking with their conventional header, what are some things they should keep in mind before they pull into their fields?
Yeah, so, a couple things. We obviously want to adjust the reel as tight as possible as we can to aid in that conveyance material. As we mentioned, adding some rubber belting or other material to the bats of the reel. The one thing we haven't mentioned yet, if you're having heads that are being flipped out from the top of the auger, you can add a small strip of angle iron behind and below the feed auger to kind of help with material conveyance. Basically, means we have so little material in there, give another backing surface to help that material push against and move against until it feeds into the machine. And so that's something that can be done. And again, sickles and guards are going to be really important as well, because we just don't have a lot of material. These thin stands, we don't have a lot of material, pushing things to the bottom of that V between the sickle and the guard to assist in cutting.
And now that we've talked about kind of the operation to get it off the fields, but the big old combine, are there adjustments that need to be taken place in the combine to hopefully decrease loss?
Yeah, so I think the biggest take-home message here is that, a combine, in terms of how you're used to setting that machine and a combine's responsiveness to change in settings is going to be quite a bit different maybe than what you're accustomed to. And so if we think about in a more typical year, we've got a lot more material moving through that machine, material other than grain or mog. And that kind of adds an overall dampening effect. And so if you think about how responsive a combine is going to be to changes in rotor speed or cylinder speed, changes in concave clearance, it's going to be much more sensitive. It's going to be much more reactive to those changes in settings, simply because we don't have all that material in the machine kind of dampening the effects there. And so, we got to, always pay attention to, of course, grain damage and high cylinder speed or high rotor speed is always, typically the leading cause of damaged grain. But, typically even with this thin crop, typically our concave clearances might not change that much, but we may need to add some blanking plates to improve separation. We may need to reduce our fan speeds because we're simply not running as much material through the machine. And as always, we always recommend, of course, producers do some kill stops in the field and actually be able to take a look at where material is in that machine and what the losses are behind the combine.
There's a reason we're talking about this. It's short wheat, so it might be not what people are used to getting out of their fields. However, when cutting the wheat, we don't want to just take everything off the ground. There's reasons that you want to leave 2/3 of that stem there.
Yeah, so that's a real challenge is, especially for those of us in dryland scenarios. One of the huge reasons we grow wheat is so that we have that residue to plant a row crop into next year. And we're certainly going to be limited on that. And so anything we can do, I guess I would suggest, there's quite a bit of economic value to leaving as much of that stubble out there as possible. And that becomes really difficult in a year like this when the wheat's short. And the temptation is really to just, mow it off at the ground. But it's hard to strike that balance. But certainly I think there's benefits to the subsequent crop if we can kind of shoot for a happy medium there and get the grain, but also try and leave as much of the stubble as possible.
And if producers are saying, yes, I have short wheat in my fields, what's the very first step that you would recommend they take?
I think, first think about, do you want to try something different from a header standpoint? And make sure, again, especially if you're trying, we've talked about stripper heads, especially if you're trying something new, make sure you get, some understanding on getting the adjustments right so you have a good experience with, be it a flex draper or stripper head, get some training from the dealer or from a neighbor who knows, has a lot of experience with one. Make sure if you're trying something new, make sure you're going into it to have a good experience. And then I think the second key point is just be aware that combines are going to be much more sensitive to the changes we make, on various adjustments. And so it's going to take maybe a little extra time and effort to get things dialed in.
Lucas, I appreciate you taking the time to join us and talk about harvesting short wheat, as that's probably a common occurrence for many producers this year. I appreciate it.
You bet, Shelby. And we've got a bunch of additional information, some more details. Folks can look this up in the Agronomy e-update that came out on June 1st.
That was K-State Extension agronomist in Colby and Tribune, Lucas Haag, and the Agronomy e-update article will be linked in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we round out our Friday show with our weather update. And as always, we're joined by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
And Chip, some good news. We had more rain over the past weekend.
Yeah, we had several complexes of storms that moved across central and even western Kansas, too. Eastern Kansas still kind of stayed dry, especially the northeast, but fairly widespread, 3/4 to 1.5 inches or so. Some folks in localized areas saw more than that, up to 2 to 3 inches, and even so a couple of flood warnings were issued that were localized. And then some folks saw none at all. And we're in that classic summer pattern. The good news is we just saw more of a complex, more structured storms, so the precipitation was definitely a little more widespread than we had seen the last few weeks.
And looking just at western Kansas, they've gotten pretty significant amount of rain.
Yeah, there's folks starting to complain that they can't get in their fields, and so as a meteorologist, you can't win. Either you're too dry or too wet. But definitely round after round of storms for folks in western Kansas. There's been some severe weather associated with those as well. We've seen some areas of hail. I think there was even one tornado report over the weekend. And so as we've increased this year, we've gotten more rain, but we're getting a little bit of the negative double-edged sword side as well.
And as we've gotten more rain, looking a little bit more towards average or above average.
for the state, we are right around the wettest time of the year. In fact, when you look at like central and eastern Kansas, our average precipitation is actually starting to decrease. Very slowly, but decreasing on a weekly basis, where western Kansas we're right about there now. Most folks should be getting around anywhere from 1/10 to 2/10 of an inch of rain a day. And so when we think about like an inch of rain over the weekend, that was enough to cover about 5 days worth of rainfall. And so we can dry out that quickly, and we need moisture to continue keeping up with it. And to dig into any drought, we need to see much above normal. So we're talking a lot more rain. And unfortunately, this time of year, when we get that much rain, it comes down really hard.
And so a little bit of improvement in the drought monitor?
Yeah, we had a little bit of improvement in the drought monitor, mostly in western Kansas, where they keep seeing that moisture. And then we still have a lot of exceptional drought out there, especially one area we're watching really carefully is that north central area. They keep missing moisture events like that Belleville around the Nebraska borders, really dry area. And even though we've had good moisture in a lot of places, we're seeing short-term benefits of green grass, some good starts to ag, or at least the crops. But we're not seeing the long-term benefits yet. We're not seeing ponds fill back up. We're not seeing subsurface water levels increase. So there's still a lot of long-term things we need to overcome yet to get rid of drought completely.
Step back from precipitation, the temperatures are kind of starting to warm back up.
Yeah, well, we've had a cool week. In fact, we were really cool Monday and Tuesday. Some folks are down into the mid-40s in central and western Kansas. So very cool conditions. We're entering the kind of a concern period where we start to see temperatures rapidly warm. Our highs will get back into the low to mid-90s by next week. And I think about like cattle concerns where that's a big change, and cattle are more acclimated to cooler, wet weather. We could see some potential for increased cattle loss if folks don't take proactive measures to help those cattle cool off.
As temperatures rise, are we also going to see a rise in severe weather?
Yeah, so as temperatures rise, I think we're actually going to see our moisture kind of taper off. We have a really active southern jet stream right now that's being contributed to by El Nino that's developed, which is kind of abnormal for the summer months. But that's why we're seeing severe weather, especially towards south. That jet stream is going to shift north into central and northern plains over the next week and a half. Most of that moisture is going to follow with it. So I think, well, more spotty chances of storms, probably a week to 2 weeks of drier conditions. And so we'll not see severe weather associated with that. But also we think about we need moisture to keep things growing. So flash drought concerns can increase very rapidly this time of year.
And recently the monthly outlook came out, and so what's that looking like?
Yeah, so July right now is looking at above or below normal moisture-wise. As that jet stream moves north, we just have a lot less uncertainty. Likely we'll hedge towards the drier side, I think. And temperatures are going to increase with that in July. As you get into the August, September, we're weighted a little bit heavier towards increase in precipitation across the state with above normal precipitation favored for most of Kansas as that jet stream starts to come back south for the fall. That'll be a likely active time and probably a wetter time in the state. And temperature-wise, we'll be above normal for the most part through that period.
Chip, I appreciate you coming in and giving us our weather update.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you for this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with you on Monday.